So is that a yes to go ahead?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, here we go, folks. And everybody can now hear me online. Is that correct, Susie?
They should be able to. If anybody can't, do let me know in the Q&A button.
Okay. Okay, welcome everyone to today's CEDIL webinar on evaluating complex interventions in international development. For those of you who don't know, CEDIL stands for the Centre of Excellence for Development, Impact and Learning. And CEDIL is funded by, with UK aid from the UK government. And CEDIL's brief is to develop and test innovative approaches to impact evaluation and evidence synthesis in low-income countries. Today, you will hear from 3 speakers, and you'll then have plenty of opportunity to ask them questions about what they have had to say. Our 3 speakers are Edoardo Masset, who is the Deputy Director of the Centre of Excellence in Development, Impact and Learning, CEDIL, and Associate Professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Edoardo will present the results of a CEDIL review of methods for evaluating complex interventions. He will then be followed by Estelle Raimondo, who is from the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. Estelle was a co-editor with Michael Bamberger and Josh Basson for the 2016 publication Dealing with Complexity in Development Evaluation, a Practical Approach. Estelle will be introducing current approaches and experimentation on the evaluation of complex interventions. And thirdly, Peter Craig is a Professor of Public Health Evaluation, MRC/CSO, Social and Public Health Sciences Unit, University of Glasgow. Peter is the lead author of the influential MRC Guidelines on the evaluation of complex interventions and a member of the team which has just completed a revised and updated framework. Peter will discuss the thinking behind the revision of the MRC Guidelines. After their presentations, we will take questions from the audience. The event will be chaired by myself, Rick Davies, an independent evaluation consultant and member of CEDIL's intellectual leadership team and author of the CEDIL Inception Paper 25, representing theories of change, technical challenges with evaluation consequences. A reminder, CEDIL has published now more than 20 inception papers, guidelines, method briefs, and working papers. And these are now all accessible on the CEDIL website. Just Google CEDIL to find them. A few other reminders before we begin. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the CEDIL website in due course. Please only use the question and answer function at the bottom to ask questions. The chat function has been disabled, I've been told. The webinar will last for 75 minutes and we expect at least 35 minutes of this time to be available for questions and answers. And finally, please complete the post-webinar survey, which will be redirected to at the end of the webinar. That's the end of all the reminders. And right now I will hand over to Edoardo for his presentation.
Thank you, Rick. And thanks everyone for attending the seminar. Going now to share my screen. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to talk today about the review of methods to evaluate complex interventions. This is a review that was commissioned by CEDIL, and just a couple of words in terms of the motivation for the review. CEDIL was established, among other reasons, for precisely with the goal of developing new methods for complex interventions. Now, there are already a number of reviews in the literature for complex interventions, and including in development. And so our contribution is actually to have a much stronger focus on development. We also have restricted our review on methods that address causality. And finally, we are trying in the review to map methods to projects, meaning to identify methods that are particularly suitable for specific types of interventions. So what is a complex interventions? I'm going to start with that. And I have depicted the complex interventions as being an intervention which consists of many activities and many inputs. They can be interacting with each other, they act on a system, and you get out a wide range of outputs. So two main characteristics. The first, there are multiple activities interacting, multiple components. And secondly, the interaction can create complex outcomes, such as feedback loops or traps or tipping points. And one typical example of complex outcome is the synergy. So where you have two components implemented at the same time, and you get a result that's an outcome which is larger than the sum of the impacts produced by each component separately, independently implemented. We did a sort of a taxonomy of complex intervention in development, and we identify three typical complex interventions. The first is what we call the simple multiple component. And this is intervention with many activities. And this is the type of intervention that normally people design and implement precisely with the goal of exploiting, trying to exploit the interactions and synergies across components. And there are many examples of these in the poverty reduction program, nutrition interventions, and the like. A second type of intervention is what we call portfolio interventions. And this is not particularly different from the previous one. There's still multiple components, but one key difference is that the portfolio interventions are implemented at a very large scale and over a long period of time. And so they are normally implemented at the national level or across several countries. And an example of this is, for example, the President's Malaria Initiative, Feed the Future, lots of intervention implemented by major UN agencies or big donors. A third type of interventions is what we call the system level intervention. In this case, still multiple components, but the goal of the intervention is really to change the entire system. So there are interventions on food system, education systems, and health systems. In the picture, in the chart, in the figure in the slides, there's a chart of system level intervention on changing markets to the benefits of the poor. So that was used to be a typical intervention in this area. Our review, as I mentioned, is focused on methods to evaluate this intervention that we're trying to do two things. One is precisely address the complexity of the intervention, and secondly, to address causality. We selected a number of methods, those that you can see in the table, in the column in the middle. And so there are some methods coming from the experimental tradition, like factorial design and adaptive trials, qualitative comparative analysis, synthetic controls, agent-based modeling, and system dynamics. So we look at particular those methods. It's not a comprehensive list, but it's quite large. And we look at literature to find studies that we're using those methods in evaluating development programs. We did a systematic search, looking for some key repositories and specialized journals and systematic reviews. And we found a number of studies that you can see in the table on the column on the right. And so the first observations that we can say about this review is that the studies are not many, right? So with the exception of factorial design, where we find 27, but I'm going to explain that, in fact, the number is much smaller than that. But with that exception, so we didn't find a huge number of studies in terms of empirical application of these methods. Now, what follows, I'm going to talk a bit more in detail of each of these methods and what we found in the review, and then I will say some final general comments or conclusion drawing from the review. So the first method is the factorial experiment. A factorial trial is a randomized controlled trial, but what is the difference in comparison to a standard randomized trial? Well, the simplest one is what is called the 2x2 factorial, where you have a control group, you have an intervention, for example, teacher training, you have another intervention, for example, providing books, and then you have a third intervention, which is the combination of the other two. So you have teacher training and books at the same time. That allows to detect any interaction effect, any synergy between the other, the two interventions. We found 26 of this type of studies. I'm going to mention one key finding of this review is that only about one third of these factorial designs found significant interactions. So that means the large majority of studies didn't find any synergy in the experiments. Now, I'm going to make now a distinction between what is a true factorial and multi-arm design. So in fact, there is only one study that we found, which is a true factorial design. It's a study that has been presented and in the CEDIL seminar, and there's an evaluation of a parent intervention in Eastern Europe, where the combinations between interventions were many more than two. There were 8. And although this is not the only difference between a factorial design and a 2x2 multi-arm design, so one is the combination intervention, and the number of combinations, but the main difference is actually the goal of the study. So a true factorial design is not intended to evaluate the effectiveness of intervention, rather to identify those activities, or those combinations of activities that are more promising, right? So it's a factorial design is part of the design of a project, is not the evaluation of an intervention properly. The second type of method that we look at is adaptive trials. Here we found only 2 studies. This is interesting because the literature on adaptive trial is huge, but is entirely theoretical. It goes back to the 60s, but in terms of empirical application, there are very few. An adaptive trial is, what is the difference in comparison to a standard RCT? Well, normally in a standard trial, you design the study, you collect the data, and finally you analyze the data. And while in an adaptive trials, what you do is that after collecting the data, you may change the design. So based on the data that you have collected at the baseline or maybe the midterm, you change the design of the study. And the change can consist in changing the sample size, changing the treatment groups, or changing the hypothesis. There are all sorts of changes that you can make. Now, as I mentioned, we found 2 studies, and one is a labor market intervention in Jordan. The other one is an agricultural extension in India. To make an example, the agricultural extension in India intervention included 6 different ways of reaching farmers by phone. And so what the study did was basically to allocate subject to the different groups, depending on the effectiveness of the intervention. So basically the allocation to the treatment group increases as depending on how effective is that specific treatment. So it's not only that we have only 2 studies, but both studies are also using the same type of change to the study design, and among many other changes that can be made. So just want to point out that this is definitely a very underutilized approach. Third approach that we looked at is qualitative comparative analysis. Here, again, there is very large literature. And in fact, we found a larger number of studies, up to 8. And qualitative comparative analysis is based on the idea of multi-causality. And so the fundamental idea is that effects are not produced by a single cause, but several causes at the same time. And so when we speak about projects, one example is the causal pie that I'm showing the slides. It comes from an evaluation by Eleanor Ostrom of irrigation interventions in Nepal, where she found that the impact of the positive impact of the intervention, while the irrigation intervention was successful only when was implemented at the same time with collective action and written rules. The idea of QCA is identifying the recipes, the combination of factors that are successful and those that are not successful as well. Now, and in our review, actually, we found that the majority of studies were looking at, rather than the combination of activities in a project, the interaction between projects and a characteristic of the context, right? But that doesn't prevent the method to looking at multiple components. So it's definitely, it seems to be an ideal method for evaluating multi-component interventions. And the next method that we looked at is synthetic controls, and synthetic controls is quite recent. And considering that it's relatively new, we found 8 studies, which is quite a large number. is very simple to interpret. So this is in the chart, for example, is showing the impact of a malaria intervention over a period of about 40 years, impact on children education. And the interpretation of this chart is extremely simple. So it's a very effective way of presenting the results. Now, one limitation that it has is that it only applies to interventions that have very large effects and that they are implemented over a long period of time. Now, that's, however, it is the kind of intervention that we call portfolio intervention. So, you know, it is, we believe, suitable for this type of evaluations. Finally, the last method that we look at is agent-based modeling and system dynamics. These are modeling methods. They are not evaluation of effectiveness of interventions. They are not observationals. They're simulations of impacts of interventions. Again, it's a large literature. These methods are not new. They were developed many years, in some case of system dynamics, many years ago. And we did find quite good numbers of studies. These approaches really do the job of addressing complexity, because complexity is modeled. Within the model, they build complexity in the forms of either feedback loops, like in the case of system dynamics, or through interactions between agents in agent-based modeling. Now, one limitations of this approach that I will discuss again in my conclusions is that by building complexity into the models, they end up having quite a limited predictive power. So, you know, by reviewing the studies from this review, the recommendations coming out of these studies are not particularly strong. But I'll talk again about this in my conclusions. So the first general conclusion that I want to make about the study, as I said, is trying to match projects to methods. And so our recommendation for review is that multi-component intervention, factorial and adaptive experiments and QCA seems to be promising methods. We would recommend, on the other hand, synthetic controls methods for portfolio interventions. And while for system-level interventions, we need modeling studies. And of course, agent-based modeling and system dynamics are obvious choices for this type of projects. Second observations that I would like to make based on the review is I'm going back to the comments about the factorial designs that we look at. Remember that I said that we look at interactions, analysis of synergies by factorial design, but just in 1/3 of the study, there was actually a significant interaction. Now, this can be interpreted in different ways, but one interpretation of this is that, well, maybe there wasn't that much complexity after all. So actually the impacts were linear. Or you may say, well, the impacts were perfectly linear within the short time frame that was considered by the intervention, or by the scale, small scale of intervention itself. and I have another couple of comments to make, general comments before concluding. And this further comment is about experimental designs and complexity. Now, I put this picture where, I'm showing different factors and levels to produce a cake. Now, if you are a manufacturer or a bakery and you want to produce a cake to sell it on the market, you will first do a lot of experimentation and testing with different combinations of sugar, flour, eggs, and temperature before going into the market to sell your product. Now, when it comes to evaluation of development intervention, it seems to me that we just jump to the cake, right? So we jump to evaluate the cake as it is. And we forget the experimental phase at the design stage. Now, this is what factorial and adaptive experiments are trying to do, is precisely testing combinations of factors at the design stage in order to produce a nice cake. And I think this is quite an unexplored area of in evaluation, particularly for those researchers that are using randomized controlled trial, and certainly an area to explore more in the future. A final comment that I want to make is about use of agent-based modeling and system dynamics. These are great methods. They do address complexity directly, but this is in the slides a model using system dynamics of the interaction between tobacco control interventions and tuberculosis. Now, I don't know if it gives you the idea of the complexity of the study itself, but what I'm saying here on the slides is that definitely if the context is complex, simple models will give you a wrong prediction. But on the other hand, there is a risk that if there is too much complexity in your model, you don't get any prediction at all. So I think there is a need to balance the complexity of the model with what are the requirements for decision making. And so in other words, it's good to build complex models, but maybe they shouldn't be too complex. So these are my conclusions. These are highlights from the review, and there is more in the review, and hopefully you will be able to read the review once it will become available on the CEDIL website. Thank you.
Thank you, Edoardo. Just a correction on earlier, our next speaker will be Peter, and then after that, Estelle will speak. And I noticed we've got 6 questions in the listed up there by people wanting to ask questions about this presentation. I just ask you to be patient because we'll proceed with the 3 presentations and then have the Q&A session. So now, Peter, if you could take us forward.
Thank you very much, Rick, and thanks very much to CEDIL for inviting me to contribute to this webinar. Hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes briefly outlining the thinking that went into the update and revision of the MRC's guidance on evaluating complex interventions. The revision is complete. I'll give you a reference to it at the end. It's still forthcoming in terms of publication because we want to publish the main report that we've completed along with a journal paper, and the paper is still under consideration at the journal, but hopefully it will be available open access within the next few weeks. So I've entitled this this talk from complicated interventions to events in complex systems, and this is an attempt to capture the change in thinking that's taken place over the 3 editions of the MRC's guidance that have now been produced. So the first edition of the guidance, which appeared in 2000, took a somewhat linear approach to thinking about how complex interventions might be developed and evaluated, a kind of linear sequence based very closely on the way pharmaceutical interventions are developed and tested. And this is, this is fine. This can work well if researchers have a great deal of control over the context in which they're implementing the intervention. And also if they start from the right place. If you have a promising intervention, it might move, with a good mechanistic evidence base, it might move smoothly between the different phases towards large-scale pragmatic trials. But very often researchers don't have this kind of control over the process. Quite often they're testing interventions in context of which they have relatively little control. They may not have had much involvement in developing the intervention. They're evaluating something that's originated from policy and practice rather than from their own laboratories. So in the update of the guidance we took that appeared in 2006, the BMJ paper, which is the most widely, I think, known representation of the guidance, appeared in 2008. In this update, we took a less linear approach, acknowledging the likelihood that very often you would not move necessarily smoothly from a development study to a pilot and feasibility study, or from a feasibility study to a large-scale evaluation, and that you might have to revisit the earlier stages if it turned out that the intervention you developed was not acceptable in the context in which you wanted to implement or test it. Or your feasibility study might show that there are other problems with delivery and acceptability, which meant that it would be premature to go ahead to evaluating the intervention from the point of view of effectiveness. So you might have to repeat the feasibility or the piloting work after you've revised the intervention, or go right back to the development stage and make some more fundamental changes to the intervention itself before it's worth investing in a large-scale evaluation study. So this more recursive approach, this more iterative approach, the centerpiece of the updated guidance. And I think if the guidance has been widely cited, that's very different to saying it's been widely influential. But I think if it has had any influence, it's by emphasizing the need to invest appropriately, which is often heavily, in this early development and feasibility and pilot testing stage, rather than skimping those and then investing heavily in the evaluation of interventions. If you do that, there's a risk that you're wasting money testing interventions which have little prospect of being effective, or even if they are effective, little prospect of being more widely implemented. So in investing heavily in the earlier phases is often good value and is and should be seen as good practice. So as I said, the guidance has been very widely cited. It continues to be widely cited, which kind of begs the question: well, if it's not broke, why are we trying to fix it? Well, the reason basically is that a great deal has happened in relation to thinking about complexity and complex interventions in the 10, 12, 13 years since the last edition of the guidance appeared. And it's this change in thinking that we've tried to encapsulate in the most recent version of the guidance. Now, in the last edition, I think it'd be fair to say that we were still thinking about complex interventions really in terms of complicated interventions that might have a lot of moving parts or might be difficult to deliver. So the implementation might differ from context to context in terms of how easy the implementers find it to actually deliver the intervention, train the deliverers, and so on and so forth. But complexity here is still seen very much in terms of a property of the intervention itself, rather than of the property of its interaction with its context. And if I can use an example to elaborate on this distinction. One I often use is this idea of the lucky iron fish. Now, in one respect, you could not have an intervention simpler than the lucky iron fish. It's a small iron ingot that people are expected to place in their cooking pots when they're boiling water or cooking rice. And the idea is that a little bit of the iron from the fish leaches out into the cooking water, and that this can help prevent anemia. So what could be simpler than the lucky iron fish? It has no moving parts at all. But if you think about how an intervention like this achieves its effect, then immediately you can see lots of different layers of complexity. If you want to use the iron fish as an intervention to prevent anemia, for example, I think it was developed for use in villages in Cambodia. You have to think about how the ingots can be manufactured in a way that makes them cheap enough to distribute to people in that kind of setting. You also have to think about what are the cultural meanings of the iron ingot, what will make it appealing to people to use. You have to think about things like whether, what are the causes of dietary anemia, or what are the causes of anemia? And they're not all dietary, for example, in all populations. So there's all these extra dimensions that you need to think about, so that even a very simple intervention can, if you think about these dependencies on the nature of the supply chain, the population that are expected to use it, its cultural meanings, the economics of production and supply and so on, then even an intervention as simple in its own right as the iron fish can have lots of complexity, which is very relevant to the kinds of evaluation questions you might want to ask about it as an intervention to improve health. So from this point of view, nearly all interventions can be considered as complex if you think about them in terms of their dependencies on the context in which they're implemented, and the knack, if you like, the art of evaluating complex interventions is to work out which of these relationships are important and how much of this complexity is actually relevant to your evaluation question. And the updated framework suggests various ways in which you should approach this. Like the earlier edition of the guidance, it takes a phased approach. It emphasizes very strongly the need to invest appropriately in the early stages of developing or identifying an intervention if it's not one you're developing yourself, and testing its feasibility before you go on to think about investing heavily in a large-scale evaluation. And what we suggest to the researchers do as they move through the phase is to keep revisiting a set of core questions. And then the 6 groups of questions, if you like, that we think that researchers should revisit are identified in the oval in the middle of this diagram. We suggest that researchers should always consider context, and this is at all stages. This is not something you just work out at the start and then leave as you move through the phases of development and evaluation. You have to keep revisiting your model of how the intervention relates to its context. Researchers should think in terms of, researchers should use program theories to define their concepts of how their intervention achieves its effects, and also to represent that understanding when they deal with stakeholders. We emphasize that engaging stakeholders is vital right at the start, but also throughout the process of development, evaluation, and through to implementation as well. At each stage, the focus should be on identifying key uncertainties. What are the gaps? What do you need to know in order to move forward with the evaluation? These will differ from context to context and from intervention to intervention. So it's not just a question of defining these up front and settling that question once and for all. You have to keep revisiting this as the evidence accumulates. Intervention refinement. Again, the intervention very often should not be fixed at the outset of the evaluation process. It may need to be adapted as you go along, and Edoardo gave a good example of a method that can incorporate this in a very systematic way. And then finally, we emphasize that economic considerations should be considered throughout the development and evaluation process, rather than tacked on at the end and left until you've got evidence of effectiveness. It's important to think about the value of information that the value of the information that your evaluation will yield before you embark on any kind of large-scale research effort. So those are the things that we suggest that researchers keep uppermost in their minds as they're developing and evaluating complex interventions. 4 points to make about the overall framework before I finish. Well, first, to reiterate that complexity is very much a function of the relationship between an intervention and its context rather than a property of the intervention itself. Development and evaluation should be seen as a kind of recursive approach where you move back and forth between stages rather than plowing on from one to the next, regardless of the way the evidence is accumulating. The guidance is completely pluralistic with regard to methods. We reject any idea of a hierarchy of research designs, the methods should be chosen from the whole toolkit available to evaluators in terms of the specifics of the evaluation problem that they're facing, rather than on the basis of assumptions about some methods always being best in all circumstances. And then finally, the kind of overarching aim of evaluation we suggest should be to provide evidence which is useful for decision making. The goal is not to implement a design which yields the most unbiased estimate of effectiveness. It should be to provide information that is useful, and often that will involve trading off a bit of precision and possibly a bit of bias against the value of the information for decision making, but it's the latter that should guide people's evaluation decisions, not simply an attempt to provide precise unbiased estimates of effectiveness that are somehow generalizable to all contexts. So that's the thinking behind the updated guidance.
Thank you very much, Peter. And we'll now hand over to Estelle.
Thank you. Let me start sharing my screen. It will take 1 minute. All right. Thank you very much for having me at this webinar. And I think, before I get started, I think I need to give you a little bit of context for the type of evaluations that we conduct at the Independent Evaluation Group. We, as the name indicates, are independent of the intervention in some ways. So we typically evaluate ex post, and we, by the function of our independence, do not really get engaged in the design or the implementation of the projects and the interventions, which means that typically we do not conduct impact evaluation. And so it doesn't mean, though, that we don't have to deal with the complexity of interventions as well as how they are embedded in the systems and in their context. So what I will talk to you about today are 3 different things. First, the type of complexity that we deal with our types of evaluants, which tend to be in the categories of Edoardo, more the portfolio type of interventions. Second, I will tell you a little bit about what we've been experimenting with in terms of approaches and methodologies to try to deal with this complexity. So you will get a little bit of other types of tools and other types of data than what Edoardo has been discussing. And then finally, I want to give you my 3 kind of reflections from a practical perspective of what has happened in trying to broaden the range of tools and evaluation methods in our group. So why do I think about complexity as a default in some way is because typically, World Bank interventions, World Bank group interventions have multiple components. Projects have a range of activities and interventions at very different levels of intervention. So we tend to have intervention at the system level, meaning trying to really build the institutional framework of countries so that then they can deliver those interventions. But we also can sometimes intervene more at intervention directly, so having our activities. The other aspect of complexity is that we do have very long causal chain, especially for the types of projects that are more institutional in nature and also through different instruments such as budget support, meaning that tracing the effects of our interventions can take a very long time to actually come to fruition, and when we can observe the outcome. And these causal chains are messy and murky, and given the fact that we come ex post, reconstructing that causal chain is a real challenge. And finally, it's all of the above and then some other aspects of complexity, which Peter touched upon, and it's this embeddedness in systems and in the context, as well as the complexity of various stakeholder groups. We typically work with government institutions, but also subnational governments, as well as, of course, civil society actors and citizens themselves. And so really making sense of that stakeholder complexity is an important aspect of our work as well. I'm putting this diagram not for you to see the detail, but to get a little bit of a perspective of what I just talked about. So this is an example of an evaluation of the World Bank support to reducing child undernutrition and its determinants. And so it is very much a portfolio intervention. The team who was involved in this reviewed about 232 projects, nutrition sensitive and nutrition specific interventions. And as you can see, it has, a lot of intersectoral work, water, even agriculture, as well as health for sure, and some education aspects. Plus, there are different types of interventions themselves, from the system to then behavioral norms, and many, many components. And the difficulty for us, and I will talk about that in a little bit, is to actually be able to identify that portfolio and extract those interventions across a very wide range of projects. So with that example in mind, let me tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in terms of trying to make sense of that complexity. To simplify, I think what we've been trying to do is to do 3 different types of things. The first is to try to enhance our analysis of these complex portfolios using as much as we can machine learning, as well as layering additional sources of data beyond the data that is embedded in our administrative systems about the projects and the interventions themselves. That's the first strand of work. The second is we've really tried to think through our combination of methods and approaches and combination of data sources. And finally, we've also really tried to start experimenting with different types of case-based approaches to really try to delve further into the how of these causal processes. Let me illustrate. This little diagram on the right, which also you can't see the detail of, is a typical evaluation design. So you can see that there are many different components at all of the level of interventions. And we really try to combine sources of data so that we can ultimately have robust evaluation findings. As I mentioned, we rarely conduct impact evaluations. I will talk about a couple of examples of more econometric work that is closer to the impact evaluation that Peter and Edoardo talked about. However, we really try to embed causal analysis in our evaluation work. What do I mean by that? It's really trying to embed causal thinking in how we build plausible evidence of the contribution of the World Bank to these complex outcomes. And that means a multi-part process in our evaluation design. So it means, for instance, really checking the design alignment on the evidence of what works. So of course, making use of all the systematic review and great work that CEDIL is, for instance, involved in. The second layer will be to really check the efficacy of the implementations. That's where really the portfolio work is really crucial. The third part is really trying to layer external sources of data, and I will give a couple of examples of that. External sources of data on outcomes layered on top of the portfolio information, and whenever possible, really conducting econometric work on this. Then really having a deep view into these causal processes through case studies, various kind of case-based methods. And finally, having a really clear way of working through an analytical generalizability. So this design is probably very different from you know, the type of more research development impact evaluation kind of cycle, but this is what we're working with in our world. So in terms of quick examples, so you know, using machine learning is something we are starting to experiment with, both in the identification of the portfolio. So, you know, identifying where the World Bank has worked on nutrition, while these interventions are embedded in very different kinds of projects, as well as in trying to analyze the multidimensional portfolio. Referring back to the nutrition examples, you know, trying to make sense and identify, but also understand how these multiple components come together at, you know, rather the local level, on the institutional level. When dealing with such a wide portfolio, sometimes our brain and our manual thinking, you know, don't see all the patterns. So we've tried machine learning to start making sense of that complexity so that we can then go deeper with more traditional approaches to data analysis. A second type of things that we've been doing, as I mentioned, is trying to really layer different types of data on our more conventional way of doing evaluations through case studies and you know, portfolio work. So here is 3 examples of trying to do, you know, not complicated econometric work, more difference in differences, for instance, but using data that tries to capture a little bit of that context complexity. So, you know, by creating, for instance, a buffer zone, we are trying to reconstruct control groups. In, for instance, that example of deforestation in Madagascar, the team was looking at the changes in deforestation rates on each side of you know, the intervention line. In Ethiopia, it was about comparing, for instance, the landscape management techniques and their impact on the environment across the boundaries of the different watersheds, and the same for urban planning. A third type of experiment has really been to go in depth into case study approaches, and again, layering data within cases. So this is an example of a really nice design that my colleagues did, using some geospatial satellite data in a very specific case boundaries, interviewing and doing rigorous storytelling more on the, you know, ethnographic tradition, as well as combining 22 cases to then understand the factors and the why through a middle-end QCA study. So that's the type of case-based design that we've been trying to also experiment with. Finally, again, another case-based approach for assessing carbon finance, where we have layered 3 different case methods: process tracing to really understand the causal chain and the how of the activities combining and their sequencing, and doing that in enough cases that we could also look at factors across through a QCA and a bit of a qualitative pattern matching. Let me finish so that we have ample time to discuss with maybe 2 or 3 practical considerations. So reflecting on this really experimenting journey and dealing with complexity, you know, there are key aspects to consider, and this trade-off that Peter alluded to are very salient in our work as well. So our evaluations typically, you know, take 1 year, so you know, it's not a really long time, and so we are sometimes bound by that. Of course, by capacity, I also mean, you know, methodological capacity, but also this brokering capacity of being able to experiment with methods, but also speak to the audience, because, you know, trying new approaches that are not straightforward to explain has its challenges in a world where the evaluation is really message driven. It is for decision makers who might not want to, you know, delve into the intricacies of the methods, but they want to be sure that the evidence is strong. So that's also a dilemma and something we're working towards. As well as, you know, we operate in a world still very much driven by results-based management and you know, the dominance of indicators and simple metrics. So we need to fit that with the methodological work that not always translate in these types of simple metrics. So finally, how do we do that? So we really try to, and I work for the methods advisory function at IG. So we really try to nudge experiment and support teams in doing that. And then, you know, going from niche work to more innovation and thinking through, okay, what were the methods that worked? What were the things that did not work? How can we share across team, and how can we consolidate and have some kind of feedback loop? So also experimenting within is really important, not only on the intervention side, but on the evaluation side as well. And finally, engaging the decision makers, the audience, is really important, so that we also speak to their needs and make sure that the methods is, I mean, robust, but also understandable. Let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and getting to a discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle. And now we've come to the question and answer session of this webinar. I'm going to lead with a couple of questions to get the discussion going, and then we'll move over to the questions from the audience, of which we've got some already there in the Q&A. I'll also invite the presenters to respond to some of the questions I circulated to them before this event. If we have time, they could just pick up any of those questions I've asked and respond to ones that are of interest to them. I think one of the questions I've already posed to everybody is, okay, we've got various methods. Is it a matter of, you know, which method do we choose, one versus the other? And or is it more a matter of how do we combine different methods? And I think the answer is a bit of both, but I want to ask the participants their views on what sort of creative combinations do you think would be really worthwhile exploring in the near future in respect to each of your areas. I think Estelle has probably touched upon this already, but if we look into the future, what sort of combinations of methods do you think would be really interesting to explore? And I invite anyone to respond to that out of the three presenters.
Can I
go ahead, Edoardo?
Have a go quickly. Yes, I'm all in favor of mixing methods, of course, and combining. And one thing that I would like to say, however, is that lots of these methods are already very demanding and to be undertaken in their own. So, you know, if you say, oh, combining a trial with modeling, so that's, you know, there are practical issues from a pragmatic point of view. Is not that simple. Now, if I have to think of something that in the future is going to be more and more important, is something that I have not covered in the review, or not very much, and which is the use of machine learning methods and of better computation. So I think improvement in computation and at least to, you know, to statistical approaches will bring and a lot of benefits in the future. So I think that's an area where you know, the meeting of the causal inference literature and of the more computationally oriented statistical literature of machine learning.
Okay, and Estelle, would you have any comments?
Sure. I mean, so I think it's a very important question. We do combine methods all the time because we have to in some ways, but I think it's also about the sequencing that is quite important, and you know, we have to reflect and iterate. So we typically do, you know, case-based approaches towards the end as well. So we have our, you know, macro view on the portfolio using machine learning, using some econometric work, and then we delve usually in those particularly salient interventions through different kinds of case studies, and that has worked quite well. But if we could, I think what would be really interesting in then to go back to a more you know, quantitative approach after we've understood what were those recipes through QCA, etc., and possibly use some of the methods that are more econometrics, and so, for instance, those synthetic control, etc. We just kind of always run out of time in some ways after really having understood the complexity. We would need a phase two, but that would be, I think, something really important. And then on machine learning, there are so many opportunities, I think, and to both comparing them with causal inference techniques, but also then in our more, also case-based and qualitative work, there is quite a lot of opportunities to, after having kind of laid out the whole map of complexity, pick some areas and go more in depth.
Thank you. Peter.
Yeah, I think I would endorse what Estelle and Edoardo already said, that in a sense, mixing methods should be almost the default. It's what you should expect to do. Even if you're doing a trial and you've got the capacity and the leeway to randomly assign people or clusters to be exposed or not exposed to the intervention, you will still want to layer on other methods beyond the basic trial methods, such as a process evaluation, an economic model for, to look at the lifetime benefits of the intervention rather than the ones that are just observed in the trial period and so on. I think mixing methods, I think, is particularly important in relation to, naturally experimental kinds of evaluations, because very often, well, by definition there, you do not have control over how exposure is determined, and you have to find a way of modeling that process of allocation, and usually you have an imperfect model of that process, but your ability to get an informative estimate absolutely depends on being able to somehow predict exposure in terms of the baseline characteristics of the units. Because you can't do that imperfectly, it makes very good sense usually to use a range of methods which rely to some extent on different assumptions, so that you might use both an interrupted time series kind of approach, but also a synthetic control approach, which uses far more different exposed and unexposed units, and therefore it's not relying on the kind of assumptions you're making in a simple controlled interrupted time series kind of framework, and is potentially more robust to the risk that there'll be some kind of external shock affecting one or other of the units that might have a bigger influence potentially on outcomes than the actual intervention itself. So yeah, using a combination of methods, I think should be the default in evaluation of complex interventions. And the range of methods, I think, should very much be seen, as I said, as a kind of toolkit.
Okay, Peter, if I can just stop you there, on the range of methods in the toolkits, one thing that struck me when I read the papers, I was asking myself, do case studies have a place in the toolkit for analysing complex interventions? Because classically, case studies were the way to understand complex events. But I didn't see them in Edoardo's presentation, and Edoardo will have a comment on this very shortly. Even with Estelle's presentation, when she's talking about case-based approaches, when you look at QCA, for example, which is supposed to be a case-based approach, dominantly it's a cross-case analysis, and you rarely see much reference to the within case content. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily the case with Estelle's actual practice, but I think it's often more in word than in practice. So where do case studies fit within as a tool for analysing complex interventions? Edoardo.
Yeah, I'll be quick because you already mentioned. So I was going to say that QCA is a combined qualitative, quantitative method using case. So at least that's the way it should be conducted. And the same applies to synthetic control. So it's something that people maybe don't realize, but is a comparative case analysis and comes from political science originally. So it's meant to be, it's an econometric method, but there's meant to be a strong interaction between going back from the deep analysis of cases and going back to the data and feeding back to each other. So yes, there is room for case.
Estelle, do you want to make a comment? Me having past doubts on your practice?
No, I mean, so I do see, I mean, for me, it's core case. I mean, I'm also, probably biased in my practice. I am very much a case-based kind of practitioner. But I do agree that, you know, it is this dialogue between the case and then the cross case with a larger N that needs to happen. There is a lot of practice in QC. QCA is an algorithm ultimately, right? So it is a way of combining. But it's the richness of the case that allows you to have the right model. And then also kind of really, I mean, these deep, more, you know, really from a qualitative research perspective, you know, the more ethnographic work, as well as more process tracing kind of work from the political science, helps tremendously in making sense of complexity within the case. What's very important is then to build the analytical generalizability back to a larger set of understanding, and that's where it's difficult. So very much dialogue with the case and then econometrics if you can, and otherwise building your analytical generalizability.
Peter, can we have a quick comment from you, and then we'll go back to the questions that are on the Q&A list and spend the rest of our time there, I think.
Yeah, I think, again, I just endorse what the others have said. You know, case studies should be part of the mix. You know, we should acknowledge that they're providing a different kind of evidence, but it's a kind of evidence that's extremely valuable, even in the context of having, you know, very good formal evidence of formal quantitative evidence of effectiveness. We'd still want the case study evidence to provide insights into, you know, things like, you know, fidelity of delivery, and what are the mechanisms that are generating the effects, what are the contextual dependencies which won't necessarily be evident from quantitative data, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it should be part of the mix, and we shouldn't really be thinking about hierarchies. You know, it's, you know, where the key thing is to get the, you know, the quantitative estimate of effectiveness, and then we might have some qualitative evidence providing kind of, you know, a bit of color and filling in. They're both valuable. They're answering different kinds of questions, but, you know, in equally valuable ways.
Okay. Can I encourage the panel to have a look at the Q&A questions? And I think we've got two categories here, those which are open and those which are answered. If we look at the top of the list of the open ones, can I just invite anybody on the panel to respond to the comment by Osvaldo, if anybody has got some comments on that? I think it's best if you read that yourself rather than me just reading it out for you. Or if you can identify any other questions down there that you'd like to respond to. We've got 9 questions there at the moment, or 9 comments, I should say, not all are questions.
Yeah, I can take the question on modeling. So to Osvaldo, I could also only say that I agree. I mean, it's not something that we covered in our review, and but certainly, yeah, it's a good point. So we're focusing here on evaluation, not on how to adjust models. Adjust projects while they are implemented, which is probably, you know, will take us to different areas. I believe of discussion at the moment. So. Yeah, we didn't cover that, but I want to answer the question on modeling. And yes, so why agent-based modeling? Why system dynamics rather than modeling? So yeah, that's correct. So in fact, I think some of the categories that I'm using are should not be taken as referring to the specific methods, right? So that applies to synthetic controls as well. So there are lots of model methods that are being developed in that areas in time series analysis and synthetic controls that belong to the class. And the same with modeling. I think agent-based modeling and system dynamics have something different from other models which is the explicit inclusion of agents interaction and the development of feedbacks and emergence phenomena that is not present in other models, right? Because otherwise you could say, well, you know, in economics you have general equilibrium models, but these are equilibrium models. So these are the ABM and the others are trying to also look at disequilibriums, right? How do you have feedbacks, effects, and so on. So this seems to be more appropriate for the analysis of intervention that developed complex outcomes. But otherwise, yes, of course, the structural modeling and other modeling approaches are just as good. So it should be taken as sort of modeling approaches rather than, just those two. I agree.
Thanks, Edoardo. Who would like to respond next?
I mean, I can take a go at the questions that were addressed to me, which were a little bit more on, knowledge sharing. So, this idea of embedding causal thinking into the evaluative work that we do, which is not all, and by and large, actually, not causal inference and not, impact evaluations, etc. So it is something that, any evaluation that has to deal with effectiveness, including those that are more, OECD DAC criteria kind of evaluation, even process evaluation with effectiveness questions, have to really deal critically with this idea of causal analysis. And so we at IEG, we really are working towards guidance on how you do that, as well as testing out the different comparative advantages of different methods in providing as robust of a contribution story, if you want, as possible. And so I think, the contribution analysis literature writ large, as well as papers such as the one done by Elliot Stern and his whole team on expanding the range of evaluation methods for impact evaluation, would be really good starting point on guidance and how to do that. And then very quickly, there was something on how you learn machine learning. So I'm by no means a data scientist, and Rick is much more advanced than me, for instance. I'm starting to be, data science literate. There are many, many good webinars on that. The European Evaluation Society had one recently, where I think it's as a community of practice where we try different things, we share, but you sometimes need to really work with a data scientist who knows the natural language and all the different algorithms. So not all evaluators can be data scientists, but we can get close.
Peter.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this question that Mary Bundy has raised about how we can authoritatively prove causality in social development interventions when there are many other factors that could bring about the changes that we're interested in. And I think the answer is that very often we can't. We have a range of methods which provide partial answers, and the plausibility of the answers will depend on how strong the assumptions that we have to make in addition to the analysis of the data. So this goes back to the idea of using multiple ways of trying to identify impacts rather than relying on a single method which is bound to be imperfect. So I think it's a question of really piecing together a story using all the methods available rather than having an ideal design which in and of itself will provide an authoritative answer. And in addition to that, I would say that very often we shouldn't be really looking for single studies to provide those kinds of definitive answers. We should be synthesizing the data across all the cases that we have and relying on that synthesized evidence rather than on the results of single studies if we want information which is as authoritative and as strong as it can be.
Okay, I noticed we've responded to, there are 2 items with 3 upvotes, one of which we've responded to. The other one by Osvaldo, I don't think anyone has responded to that, and I think we owe a response to that considering there are 3 or 4 people who have interest in that question. Could anyone pick up on that?
I can try, although I might not be the best position because, again, we come later. I mean, dynamic evaluation, I agree. I really agree so much. So it depends on the institutional landscape where you are. And so I think it's about really aligning, having some kind of evaluative thinking in the design and throughout the phases and being able to iterate. Like, I mean, Peter's framework, I think, resonates a lot with what should be. The issue is more of, institutional mechanisms, boundaries, sometimes not incentivizing adaptiveness and more blueprint thinking. And I think we're still dealing with some of these issues, at least in some, more like multilateral and more bureaucratic setting. But I think yes, it's the way to go for sure, and COVID has shown that even more, I think.
I just want to ask the panel, we've got a couple of minutes left, 5 minutes left. Were there any questions that I shared with you that you would like to pick up and respond to? I'm quite happy if you don't want to respond to those, and we can continue looking down the list here. But if there are any questions that I asked that you'd like to respond to, please do.
I'd like to add a rider to what's just been said in relation to Osvaldo's question. I do think it is an important question. I mean, really, the division of the kind of research process into phases is partly really for, convenience of presentation. And what I was trying to emphasize was that questions of design are never, should not be considered settled right at the outset. And you might very well want to, revisit the design of the intervention if you find out, for example, that there are problems with feasibility or delivery or fidelity and so on. As you begin to evaluate effectiveness, there's a very useful distinction made, I think, by Penny Hall between the form of an intervention and its function. And what you really want to do is make sure that you retain some kind of faithfulness to the function of the intervention, but allow the form to vary as you go through the evaluation, so that if you find ways of, if you identify ways of optimizing it, or if problems crop up that you need to solve to enable implementation, you solve them as you go along, rather than sticking to a design that's already been shown to have flaws or weaknesses. And to do that, obviously, you need to, as well as trying to identify effects, you need to, gather information through a process evaluation, for example, about how delivery is going, and what are the constraints on delivery, what are people doing on the ground to adapt the interventions and make it work in the setting they're operating in, and so on. So, the distinction is one of convenience. It's not one that we think that evaluators should make too sharply. They should continue, we say very clearly in the guidance that evaluators should continue to think about design and optimizing the design and delivery intervention throughout the process of evaluating effectiveness.
Okay, can I draw attention to another question that got upvoted twice? Sorry, I've now just lost sight of it. Or maybe they've withdrawn it. No, it's now, yes, by Yuji Enrique. When measuring impacts and outcomes that are generated through multiple interventions, which may be multiple projects, how would you approach the challenge of quantifying or apportioning results to specific projects? How would you address the issue of double counting when reporting to donors and stakeholders? Does anyone have any views on that?
I might take that just quickly, because that's typically the world that I operate in. I think we have to distinguish two things. One is reporting, and we, at least at the bank, and most major donors and institutions have their system of results-based management, where you report and you have indicators by projects, etc., etc. And there are really transparent ways of doing that, which is this accounting-based thinking in some ways, to what we've been trying to talk through, which is much more of understanding interventions, understanding their effects, and mostly for, I think, learning. Of course, there is an accountability function to that, but it's about understanding how interventions come together. They can be administratively in different projects, but they happen to converge in the same areas, etc. And so that's a different kind of strand of thinking. So that would be my answer.
Edoardo, do you have any comments to make as we're drawing towards the end?
Well, I would say that, yeah, this is what the methods are trying to do. So if we mean by reporting to different donors for different interventions, and then exactly, so these are what all these methods that we're trying to describe are trying to do. What is the combined impact of different interventions, whether you do it prospectively or retrospectively. Now, if it is more about accounting for the whatever impact you found in relation to the contribution by donors in different proportions, I have no idea how to do that, and I'm not sure whether even it's would be a very useful exercise. But as for the first, yes, that's I think what is the goal of what we have been discussing here.
Okay, folks, we are now up to our 75-minute point, at which time we should be finishing this webinar. We've got the list of questions and answers here, which we'll be keeping. We'll be recording those. And also there'll be a recording. There is a recording made of this webinar, and that'll be made publicly available as well. I think at this point in time, unless anybody else has got some comments to make to the contrary, we should draw this webinar to an end. And I should say thank you on behalf of the audience for all the presenters and their presentations and the time and effort they put into those. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you also to the audience as a whole.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks again. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.